The weight of the granite. The mountains do not care about your plans or your lineage, or the soft meat of your children. They are indifferent monuments of shifting tectonic plates and calcified history that watch with cold stone eyes as we crawl across their skin like hopeful parasites. In 1938, the world was still large, and the wilderness was a hungry mouth that rarely bothered to chew before swallowing. People went into the green cathedrals of the West looking for God, but often found something much older and infinitely less forgiving. I have spent decades staring at maps until the topographical lines start to look like the thumbprint. The more you look, the more you realize that there are places in this country where the fabric of what we call reality is worn thin like the elbows of an old man's sweater. Rocky Mountain National Park is one of those places where the air feels heavy with the weight of things that should not be but undeniably are. It is a landscape of jagged peaks and hidden valleys where the silence is so thick it feels like it could stop your heart. A Sunday in July 2nd, 1938, was supposed to be a day of simple joys and the smell of pine needles baking in the high-altitude sun. William Beilhartz brought his family to the Fall River area of the park, seeking a reprieve from the dust and the grind of daily life. There were 11 of them in total, including young Alfred, who was only 4 years old and full of the reckless curiosity that comes before the world teaches you to be afraid. The sky was a hard, brittle blue, and the air was thin enough to make your lungs ache with every breath. They set up their camp near the roaring white water of the Fall River, where the spray creates a constant mist that clings to the mossy rocks like a cold sweat. It was a scene of domestic stability etched into the rugged wilderness, a group of humans trying to claim a moment of peace in a place that has never known the meaning of the word. The children played near the edge of the water, their laughter competing with the relentless drone of the rapids. Alfred was a bright spot of color in the gray and green landscape, wearing a red sweater that should have made him impossible to lose. The gap in the air. The disappearance happened in a span of time so short it defies the laws of physics and the logic of the human mind. William was walking with his son along a narrow trail that hugged the bank of the river, where the shadows of the lodgepole pines stretched out like long, dark fingers. Alfred was just a few paces ahead of his father, his small boots crunching on the dry needles and the decomposed granite that makes up the floor of the forest. The trail was clear, and the visibility was perfect under the high noon sun. William turned his head for a matter of seconds, perhaps to look at a bird, or to adjust his footing on the uneven ground. When he looked back, the trail was empty, and the only sound was the indifferent roar of the water hitting the boulders. There was no cry for help, and no sound of a struggle, and no splash to indicate a fall into the frigid depths of the river. It was as if the air itself had opened up a mouth and whispered the boy out of existence, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone and the mocking wind. The roar of the Fall River. The immediate panic was a visceral thing that clawed at the throats of the Beilhartz family as they began to scream Alfred's name into the unyielding forest. They scrambled down to the water's edge, peering into the churning white foam where the river twists and turns through narrow chutes of stone. The water was icy and fast-moving, a liquid conveyor belt that could carry a small body miles downstream in a matter of minutes. But there was no sign of a red sweater and no small hands reaching out from the currents. Searchers arrived quickly as the alarm was raised, and the park rangers began the grim task of dragging the river with hooks and nets. They assumed the boy had slipped and been swept away, a common tragedy in a place where the water is as dangerous as it is beautiful. They worked until their hands were blue with cold and their backs were breaking under the strain, but the river gave up nothing. The rocks remained slick, and the water continued its mindless descent, leaving the searchers with a growing sense of unease. 6 seconds of silence. The first 24 hours are always the most critical, and in 1938 they did not have the luxury of infrared cameras or satellite tracking. They had boots and eyes and the desperate hope that a 4-year-old could survive a night in the high country where the temperature drops like a stone after sunset. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search, forming human chains that moved through the underbrush like a slow-moving tide of desperation. They checked every hollow log and every crevice in the rocks, but the forest remained stubbornly silent. What haunts me about this case is the total absence of physical evidence on that trail where Alfred was last seen. There were no scuff marks to suggest he had been grabbed, and no broken branches to indicate a panicked flight into the woods. It was as if he had simply stepped off the map and into a dimension where our rules of cause and effect no longer apply. This is a recurring theme in these disappearances, a sudden and total vacuum of presence that leaves the investigators grasping at shadows. 1,000 eyes on the slope. By the second day, the search had expanded to include the surrounding ridges and the steep slopes that lead up toward the alpine tundra. The terrain is brutal and unforgiving, filled with scree fields that can slide out from under you and cliffs that drop off into nothingness. The searchers were exhausted, their eyes bloodshot from staring at the grey stone and the dark green timber. They were looking for a boy in a red sweater, but they were starting to feel like they were being watched by something they couldn't see. The atmosphere in the park had shifted from a place of recreation to a site of profound atmospheric dread. Men reported feeling sudden waves of nausea and a sense of being followed even when they were in the middle of a large group. Some spoke of hearing a high-pitched humming sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones, but when they stopped to listen, it would vanish into the wind. The mountains were no longer just a landscape, they were an adversary that was actively hiding the truth. The Devil's Tooth. Then came the report that turned the entire investigation on its head and moved the case from a tragic accident to something utterly impossible. A couple hiking several miles away and thousands of feet higher in elevation reported seeing a small child standing on a sheer ledge. This area was known as the Devil's Tooth, a jagged spire of rock that is difficult for even experienced climbers to navigate. They watched through binoculars as the boy looked out over the vast expanse of the park, his small figure silhouetted against the unforgiving sky. The couple described the child as wearing a red sweater and looking strangely calm as he stood on a precipice that should have been unreachable for a 4-year-old. They shouted to him, but the distance was too great and the wind carried their voices away into the canyons. By the time they were able to report the sighting and searchers were dispatched to the area, the ledge was empty. There were no footprints on the rock and no sign that anyone had been there at all. The impossible elevation. To understand the sheer impossibility of this sighting, you have to look at the map and the sheer verticality of the terrain. For Alfred to have reached the Devil's Tooth from the Fall River Trail, he would have had to travel miles across some of the most rugged country in North America. He would have had to cross multiple ridges and navigate through dense timber and climb thousands of feet in altitude, all while being 4 years old and alone. It is a feat that would challenge a marathon runner in peak physical condition. There are no trails that lead directly from the river to that ledge, and the brush is so thick in places that it acts like a wall of thorns. Yet the couple was adamant about what they saw, and their description of the red sweater matched Alfred perfectly. This is where the narrative breaks and the rational mind begins to fracture. How does a child move through the wilderness with a speed and agility that defies human limits unless he is being moved by something else? The scent of ozone and pine. As the days turned into a week, the search began to wind down as the reality of the situation set in for the family and the authorities. They had combed over 10,000 acres of land and found not a single shred of clothing or a single footprint that could be attributed to the boy. The weather remained clear, and there were no predators in the area large enough to have taken a child without leaving a trace of a struggle or a blood trail. It was a clean disappearance, a surgical removal of a human being from the environment. I have spoken to people who were in the park during similar events, and they often describe a strange stillness that precedes the vanishing. Birds stop singing and the insects go quiet, and the very air seems to hold its breath as if a predator of immense proportions is moving through the trees. Some theorists suggest that there are localized distortions in the electromagnetic field that can cause a temporary folding of space. If Alfred stepped into one of these pockets, he could have been transported miles away in an instant, arriving on a high ledge without ever knowing how he got there. The search fades. The Beilhartz family eventually had to leave the park and return to a home that felt empty and haunted by the ghost of a son who never came back. The official report remains open, but the pages are yellowed and the ink is fading into the paper like the memories of the searchers. There were no answers then and there are no answers now, only the cold facts of a boy who was there 1 second and gone the next. The Park Service stopped looking, but the mountains never stopped watching. Every year, millions of people visit Rocky Mountain National Park, and most of them leave with nothing but photos and sore muscles. But there are always those few who feel a chill on a warm July day, or who see a flash of red out of the corner of their eye on a ridge where no human should be. The wilderness has a long memory, and it does not give up its secrets easily. It keeps them buried under the granite and the snow, waiting for the next person to turn their head for just a second too long. The pattern emerges. Alfred Beilhartz is not an isolated incident, but a data point in a pattern of disappearances that stretches across our national parks like a jagged scar. These cases often involve children who vanish in the presence of others and are later seen in impossible locations or are never found at all. There is a chilling similarity in the way the physical evidence seems to evaporate and the way the search efforts are frustrated by strange weather or inexplicable equipment failures. We like to think we are the masters of our domain, but these stories suggest we are merely guests in a house with very dangerous hallways. In 1952, a boy named Keith Parkins vanished in Ritter, Nevada, and was found 19 hours later and 8 miles away, having crossed 2 mountain ranges in the middle of a freezing night. Like Alfred, he was just a toddler, and the distance he covered was physically impossible for a human of his size. The patterns are there for those who have the stomach to look at them, and they point toward a reality that is far more terrifying than a simple accident. Something is operating in the shadows of our wilderness, something that understands the terrain better than we ever will, and that sees our children as nothing more than a momentary curiosity. The unresolved silence. We sit in our lighted rooms and talk about the progress of science and the safety of our modern world, but the darkness outside the window remains unchanged. The mountains are still there, and they are still hungry, and they still move in ways we cannot comprehend. Alfred Beilhartz remains a shadow on a ledge, a flash of red against the grey stone of the Devil's Tooth. He is a reminder that the world is not a solved puzzle and that there are gaps in the map where the ink has run dry. Until we are willing to look at these cases without the blinders of conventional logic, we will never find the answers we seek. We will continue to lose people to the silence and the stone, and we will continue to tell ourselves that they just got lost or fell into a river. But the truth is, out there in the high country, whispered by the wind and etched into the granite, it is a truth that doesn't care if you believe it or not, because it has all the time in the world to wait for you to look away. Pattern recognition. The disappearance of Alfred Beilhartz mirrors the strange case of Jared Atadero, who vanished in the Comanche Peaks wilderness in 1999. Like Alfred, Jared was young and disappeared in an instant while hiking with a group, only for his remains to be found years later in a location that searchers had cleared multiple times. These cases suggest a phenomenon that is not bound by time or geography, a predator or a force that chooses its targets with a precision that is as chilling as it is inexplicable.